Hello everyone, this is Sonia Byers, CEO of Women in Transport, and you're listening to the Women in Transport podcast. Here we uncover how the intersection of identities produces different experiences for different people. While some identities may be more privileged due to their class, race, gender or faith, others may experience inordinate discrimination. Join us as we hear from the Women in Transport and take an inspiring and analytical lens through which we will understand how power and privilege interface and cross over.
Hi, I'm Becky Kearns. I'm one of the co-founders of Fertility Matters at Work.
Yeah, I'm Lucy Smith. I work for Eurovia and Taylor Woodrow doing public liaison work and social value work.
And pick someone else to intro.
And Joe.
Which one?
Joe Foxhall.
Hi, I'm Jo Foxall. I am the Wales lead for Women in Transport, but also Customer Experience Director for Transport for Wales.
Karen Camilleri, and I run my own boutique recruitment company specialising in transport.
Yeah, hi guys. I'm Vicky Glover. I'm the HR Director for Kier Highways.
And I'm Jo Pobrotten, and I'm the EA to CEO of Women in Transport.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And I'm Shireen Ali Khan, Intersectionality Lead for Women in Transport and your host for today. And thank you so much for making the time. Really important conversations to be having. And that's exactly the work we're doing with the intersectionality piece for Women in Transport. It's about bringing the stories of all women in the sector, whether they seem stigmatized or seem private. It's about bringing it all into the fore and having some really open conversations. So with that, I'm going to jump straight into our first question, with our theme being for Infertility Awareness Month and speaking about fertility and what it means in the workspace, both practically and both mentally, financially, all of the things that affect us. What are some of the misconceptions or stigmas surrounding infertility in the workplace, and how can we address them? Anyone please jump in and feel free to bring your own lived experience to this conversation as well.
We've done lots of work and research within Fertility Matters at Work. We've all got our own personal experience as well. And I think one of the main challenges when it comes to fertility in the workplace is mainly that it isn't seen as an issue. And I think that's because people don't feel comfortable talking about it. So what we find is that organisations aren't really doing anything to address this or to support this. But that's because they're not hearing their employees ask for that support. And it's kind of like a vicious circle because organisations aren't doing it, people don't feel comfortable to. And so how do we break down that barrier? But I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I've found is that quite often when it comes to going through fertility treatment, for example, it's seen as an elective lifestyle choice by organisations rather than a medical treatment, which is necessary to allow someone to have a baby and grow their family. And so I think we really need to change the narrative in terms of how we think about this, that this is a medical treatment that people go through. It's not something that people necessarily choose to go through, but it's circumstance that brings them to that. And I think the other thing that I would say in terms of misconceptions is that this is solely a women's issue. And although this is an issue that predominantly impacts women due to the nature of treatment, we know that men are also impacted, and we also need to think about the LGBTQ plus community as well, in that for them, their route to build a family will likely be through fertility treatment. So I think there's a misconception that it's a very niche issue. It's not a very common issue, and actually it impacts 1 in 6 people worldwide. So that would be my insights from the work that we've been doing.
Thank you. I think you're right around the commonality of this, because in doing some of the research and certainly the more conversations we've had collectively as a group, you realize you're not alone. And that's absolutely what we want for part of this conversation is, fertility is, I always say that everyone has their own fertility story, because you can't cut and paste and say mine is exactly the same as yours. But it's certainly in those nuances that we should be providing that support, because it isn't cut and paste. And so you can't say, well, this policy or this discretional behaviour is going to suit everybody.
Yeah, so I think my personal experience, it probably ceased about 3 years ago, but went on for 10 years prior to that. So I kind of lived and breathed this for 10 years. I think at the time, I completely agree in terms of it not being talked about, because there's no, if I came into work to announce that I was pregnant, there would be a growing bump and there's something physical in front of me to say, this is what's happening to me. So what's the risk assessment that I need to do? What do I need to take? How do I need to make sure I'm taking care of this employee? from a facility perspective, and I didn't know, the first time I was going through it, I didn't know either. And there has been, from a personal experience, so I did have reasonably good support. I didn't tell many people. I did have reasonably good support though. But I've been, there are examples where I work in construction, obviously, from a transport perspective, I cracked on, I think is the word. So I was doing very, very important injections in the toilets at black tie do's. I was doing all of this in the toilets at work. It was just a kind of and I did it 4 times. So fourth time in, it wasn't even a thing. So I think that perspective of but I did have a supportive male manager at the time, and he was supportive, but there was no again, I would do things at the hospital, I'd be straight back into work. So there wasn't that much. There was a bit of time off, but not that much. And I think what we are working towards, and what we've done, so from within Kier now, which has been generated by some people coming forward with personal experiences, is we have got policies around that. So there is granted time off, decent amount of time off for females going through it, for partners to support, because actually with 80% of men work for our business, 20% women. So actually the men need, partners need support, and LGBT, so partners need that support. So we grant that time off as well. And we've extended that because one of the other policies that we've now got is the pregnancy loss policy. So one of my worst days on it was the first time I didn't find out, and I just had to go home. So no one quite knew how to handle that bit of it. But again, the policies around how we can now talk about it. So I think the fact that we've got policies allows people to go, I'm not quite sure how to deal with this, but the policy can tell me. And actually, it's fine. Go home and do what you need to do. Not, well, I'll just, what did we do? What do we do? So I think the policies have really helped. There can be, we need to reduce that stigma, but the fact that there are policies in businesses now that allow people, therefore can policies make it really easy for line managers to go, that's what I need to do. I can provide that support. I'm allowed to provide that support. That's what I can do. So I think that's a really important part from a HR perspective, as well as to engage and supporting our line managers to be supportive of our people, whatever thing they're going through.
I think having gone through recurrent miscarriage in the workplace, I imagine what's going through my mind now that I play it back is that, right, hang on a second, I'm hoping to take some time off for maternity leave, but at the moment I'm having to take time off to grieve, to sort out my body and the physical stuff, to have operations to remove matter. I can't tell anyone I'm trying to get pregnant, because what I'm actually saying is I need some time off in the long term. Yeah. And so you're constantly living a double life. You're, having people around for drinks, or, if you drink, I'm just saying, and you're drinking non-alcoholic drinks and people looking at you going, can I try that wine? You're like, they want to try that wine. Things like that. You're constantly leading a double life. Contradiction, isn't it? It's like, well, you're taking all this time out, but you're going to take more time out. So actually, your friends and having to cover for you at work, and that's a real burden on them, I think. Yeah.
I remember, I can relate to that in a way, because I remember when I started trying for a baby, I didn't tell anyone for that reason, because I didn't want anyone to think, oh, she's going to leave. And I was close to being promoted. So I wanted to get the promotion, but at the same time, we started trying for a baby. And I got pregnant very quickly. And in my head it was like, oh, okay, right, 9 months later, I'm going to have a baby. What am I going to do about being promoted and things like that? Unfortunately, it ended up in a miscarriage. And at that point, I remember being in hospital because I had to go through procedures to have the baby removed, and thinking, oh, I can't tell them. I can't tell work, because they will find out that I had been trying for a child. In the end, I had to tell them. Unfortunately, I had 2 miscarriages after that. And I remember with the second one sitting in the office and thinking, I can't tell anyone. So I'm sitting in the office having a miscarriage, but I didn't want to leave the office because I didn't want anyone to know that it's happening again. And I think by the third one, I know it sounds horrible, but it was like, oh, here she goes again. Almost like people were thinking that I'm doing it for time off or something like that, which was awful. in the end, I did have to leave my work because it was just too much pressure. I was expected to just pick myself up and get on with it. So I knew that if I was to do IVF, because these 3 pregnancies, they were natural pregnancies, but I knew that if I was to do IVF, I couldn't have done it in that place of work because it just wouldn't work. It was not an option. So in some respect, I had to give up my job and my career to have a baby, or try for a baby, because obviously that wasn't even promised that I would have one. But yeah, so I had to give up my work, which I really enjoyed, and I made my way up from the very bottom to being a manager, just to try for a baby, to go for the treatments.
I think I was really fortunate, like you, Vicky, that my male manager was very, very supportive, and I'd spoken to him relatively early in my journey about it. But I think the fact that it became very quickly apparent that I would need to be out of the office for appointments quite regularly was what pushed me to be really open with everybody, because I didn't want, I was concerned people would think that I was skiving or taking the mick, and so I was very open about it, and that was helped by his but let's not forget that the men also at times need to have procedures and need appointments and things like that. And my husband did, and he didn't talk about it in work, and because I do think it's perhaps slightly easier for women to talk about fertility than it is even for men. So that there's another nuance there as well. But yeah, and that whole thing about taking the time out for the appointments, I was very fortunate I didn't have to do my injections in the office, because I was doing mine at like 6 o'clock at night, so I was at home. But then also kind of when you go through the IVF procedure, and then you want to put yourself wrap yourself in bubble wrap, don't you, like after whilst you're waiting to test. So I actually got myself signed off sick for 2 weeks whilst I waited, because I was just like, there is no way that I'm going to be able to go into the office and concentrate and do my job effectively whilst I'm like focused on every little twinge and feeling that I have. But then also, like, when you're going through that treatment and you're doing those injections, actually it makes you feel really rubbish, doesn't it? For those of you that have been through it, it's really uncomfortable, really unpleasant. So actually it's a good thing to give yourself the time, but I guess coupled with the hope that you will then be able to go off on maternity leave, I do think there is this kind of misconception around perhaps somebody's commitment to the workplace when they're going through those procedures. So yeah, there's so many kind of different things that you have to worry about and think about when you're already worried about something so really important.
I was actually just going to say, from Vicky's point about having policies and stuff, that's all great that they're there, but it's also about having that conversation as well, and people knowing about what language to use and what's acceptable to ask and what isn't. I didn't actually realise until I did some research this week, I can't have children. I was ill when I was in my late teens, early 20s. So I was told I couldn't have children, but the only way to try the only way to really test for that would be to try. And I didn't want to put myself through that because I'd already been through quite a horrible illness. So I chose to go with, I can't have kids. But then that's kind of really interesting in the workplace, because you hear all these policies for people, but I'm like, well, where's my policy? And research today actually showed me that there is actually a World Childlessness Week in September. I had no idea. Like, I didn't realize I was part of something. I just thought it was my own story. This was my own thing, and I'll deal with it. But actually, there's others as well. That was quite eye-opening, I think. And definitely to think of it as part of the EDI policies and stuff. I'm like, it's definitely something that I'm like, oh, well, maybe there's others that want to talk about it as well and can't do much about it, but actually just being able to have conversations, because I work in construction as well, Vicky, and you're sitting on site and lads, you come in, like, lads are like, oh, you haven't got kids, why is that? It's like, okay, right, do you want to sit down and hear about it, or you just, it's a really difficult question to ask, and well, they don't think about it, but then it's difficult to answer.
Isn't that
Yeah.
why it's so important that we have these really open and honest conversations, so people start to realize how inappropriate some of those questions are? You know, like when I knew that when I got married that we would struggle to have children. I'd already kind of had my diagnosis at that point, and immediately people start asking, don't they, also, when are we going to hear the patter of tiny feet? And on so many levels that's inappropriate. You know, I'm newly married, maybe we want to have some time just us, but also the whole spectrum of reasons why, you know, we might not want to, we might not be able to, we might not be able to afford to, you know, there's all of those things that play into it. And I do find the older generation more comfortable asking those questions than I guess younger people these days. I think there is a lot more awareness about that.
It's the advice that follows as well, isn't it? You know, when you say, "Oh, I'm going through the," oh, you should just take this vitamin. Oh yeah, I'll just take a vitamin. That'll help with
you
the
just stop
3 rounds of
about
IVF
it.
I've just been through. That's the solution.
Just
So,
relax, don't
yeah.
think about it, and it'll happen. My friend,
just
you know,
adopt.
she stopped
like to pick
trying
up
and
on.
it happened.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one thing I'd like to pick up on, you mentioned around diagnoses, and Lucy, you said the same, like similar as well, and as in like a thing had happened, and then this is the impact of it, so an illness. And Becky, when you and I had our initial briefing conversation, we both touched upon kind of medical related things, and I'd like to see if there's any other lived experience in that sense, because what I'm getting at is there is no kind of like my fertility story starts here, because it's not like that. It does start before you even know, before you're even aware of it. I learned very early on not to stress out, because I have endometriosis and polycystic ovaries. I was always taught that, you know, I might not be able to have children. So I thought, I'm not going to freak out about something that I don't know about, because that, you know, Vicky, to your point about taking the vitamin and don't stress out about stuff, I thought that's not going to do anything for me. Let me just try and kind of thrive. And I feel like you can be a mum in many different senses. I think caregiving comes in many different ways. I was always very happy with that sense. But I went through so many medical treatments just to alleviate pain. So I'm always in acute pain. It's just been part of me. I'm one of those people that always says I'm not feeling very well, and it's usually because of my endometriosis. And I luckily do have a child, but that came about because I'd had surgery to enable that to happen. And luckily, very like blessed in a million different ways, I had this child. But even that story was a real like just mind fudge to get through pregnancy, and having to not like physically not move because I don't know if I'm going to lose this child. So all those points that you think, oh, this is so full of joy, you're actually stressed out. And so you're just kind of guilty for feeling stressed out. It's all these emotional things, but that medical side of it, I don't think we discuss enough. And I've been really vocal in the workplace, because I was really, I had managers who really kind of made a point of not making me feel comfortable with being sick. And I thought, I'm not the only person that feels like this. How can we enable that sense of belonging? And Lucy, you touched on belonging as well.
You know, I'm just trying to think of the medical highlights on my journey. And I think this one was the different spaces. So I conceived really quickly, like Joe, and I naively told everyone because I was so excited. Oh, the miracle. And then I obviously lost it. And I started to get really immune to losing them. So there's 18 months between the first and the second. I was like, well, clearly I'm not easy on the conceiving. And it was always me. And my husband said to me, hey, what if it's me? I was like, what if it is? I thought of that. It was always me. It was always my fault, that guilty Catholic upbringing of mine. Then the next one, so second was that. And then the third one was another quick one. And then I was put into consultancy care. And the first thing, they did all these different tests. You get used to being a guinea pig, prodded and poked and scraped and blood and everything. And I remember saying and the second one was very traumatic. I had what's called a subchorionic hematoma. No one in the medical profession barely knows what it is. And I started blogging about it. And I actually made a friend in Australia who'd had about 23 of these subchorionic hematomas, whereas I'd only had one. I got off lightly. If it gets in the way of the placenta, you lose your baby. Some people go to full term. So I had all these different things going on. The first thing I remember was a consultant saying, I don't know why, but you don't have good eggs. And you're thinking, okay, so should I just be put into like a KFC? Or, you know, I don't have good eggs. What am I then to society? So that was weird because there was no explanation for it. And I think the subchorionic hematoma was probably the most traumatic thing, because the medics, listen, I've had so much good care. I'm not going to start faulting that, but because they didn't understand it and they were ignorant, even the medics were ignorant, I knew I was miscarrying at one point, and I said, guys, I'm miscarrying. They were like, come on, don't worry about it. There are people with much more bigger problems in here than you. I remember this really well. And then I had to ring the buzzer at 2 a.m. in the morning, and the nurse came and said, don't look back. So if I was to change anything, I would have looked back. But let's not get too heavy. But even the medical profession doesn't actually know how to support you in certain issues because it's so complicated.
Yeah.
And that journey went on and on and on and on. I had fertility fatigue, I would say.
Yeah, I think I've just been nodding along as all of you have been speaking and sharing different experiences. And I think even just talking with this group of people today, you realised that every single journey is different and every single outcome is different as well. And that's why this is such a broad topic. It's not just fertility treatment, IVF, it's about pregnancy loss, it's about childlessness, it's about fertility investigations and dealing with issues like endometriosis. And my own story was I was diagnosed with early menopause when I was 27 and suddenly told I might not be able to have children, went through rounds and rounds of IVF, and eventually I had my children through egg donation. So that's a whole other path as well. And yeah, what we were talking about earlier with leading double lives, that all these women that are going through this, and men as well, are doing this pretty much in silence and having to put on, I remember sort of I'd get myself out of bed in the morning, drag myself to work, put on the face, I'd do my job, and then I'd sob all the way home. And it's so heavy, and you try and leave it at the door, but it's impossible to do that when it's something it's such a part of your identity as well. And like you say, what people are asking you all the time: when you're having children, why have you not got children, when you're having another, all of these different inappropriate questions. And so there's so much we need to do around this conversation in terms of just opening it up, breaking down the stigma. But a couple of people mentioned the word fortunate and lucky, and in the fact that they were supported by their manager. And that's kind of why we exist as Fertility Matters at Work, because we don't want that to be the luck of the draw or something that just happens because you're lucky. We want that to be the norm. And also what we were saying about people not telling, not feeling comfortable to say. I think you said, Joe, that you thought, well, if I tell them that I'm miscarrying, then they know that I'm actively trying for a baby. And does that then mean that people are assuming that I'm not committed to my career? And where's this conversation around, like, it's not and it's not or women can have a baby or a career. It can be both. It's and we've got to start opening up these conversations, because otherwise people will continue to go through it in silence. They'll leave their jobs like you did, Joe. I considered leaving my job, and we recently did a survey with Fertility Matters at Work. We found that 93% of women had said that going through fertility struggles had an impact on their career. And that was whether or not they had left their job, they'd reduced their hours, they'd not gone for that promotion because they were trying to think about having a baby, or they'd stayed in a job because they knew they wanted to have a child and they wanted to have that maternity leave, they felt stuck. Or it might be that they've been treated badly as a result. And so there's all these different things that are happening. And like Vicky said, policy is so important as that foundation, that starting point. But it's got to be more than that. You've got to make the policy live and breathe. You've got to hear people like yourselves talking about it. You've got to equip managers in being able to have these conversations, what not to say, but also to give them the confidence to talk about it and not just ignore what's going on, but to ask, like, how are you and how can I support you through this? But knowing that everybody is different and every situation is different as well. So it's just one of those things, it always blows my mind, particularly in a conversation like this, where you realise how many different experiences have happened and just how broad this topic really is. And I think it's amazing that you're opening up this conversation, because I think unless you've been through it or been touched personally, it's very hard to understand, particularly the emotional impact, I think, that it has on somebody, and kind of the long-term impact as well.
I think what you described there is absolutely, it's really beautiful, and it's absolutely why you're doing what you're doing, and it is really where we want the next steps to be for us to treat all people is like that's the standard policies, how everyone is treated. But on that, and Vicky, when we spoke last time, you mentioned this kind of magic, so the magic middle you called it, I can't remember now the term, but at Kier Highways, I'd really like to ask everyone in the group, like, you were treated in a certain way, how would you have liked to have been treated? And then on those practical terms, Vicky and Becky, what are you doing to make sure that this is the standard? Because you all get discretion from managers who've either experienced it, or likewise those who've experienced it and just say, buckle up, because I did this, you should do it too. And so that bias does come into it. But how do you make it that this is just the standard of how we treat people within this particular topic?
I'll use the word fortunate again, but very much taking on board the fact that it should just be the way. That I worked in a small organisation when I went through IVF. I worked for Travel and Camilleri, and as I said, my manager at the time was incredibly supportive. But so when he retired, I took on the managing director role, and one of the things that I did when I was in post was put in place specific fertility and pregnancy loss policies, because as you say, Vicky, I think it's really, really important that kind of line managers are supported by that documentation and process to know how to handle it, because actually, probably for all of us, when we started the journey, it was brand new and we didn't understand it. If you've not been through it, it's very difficult to know how to support somebody through it. So I think absolutely that information and policy and process is essential. And then joining Transport for Wales, kind of fertility and pregnancy loss comes under our special leave policy. And our HR and EDI teams are really, really good at doing those lunch and learn sessions on topics and have covered fertility. And, it's about being open and having those conversations, I think. And, I do shout about it and talk, I will talk to anybody about it. I'm not embarrassed or ashamed of my journey, and if it can help other people, then great. But that's also recognizing that not everybody wants to be that open when they're going through it. Some people do want to keep it to themselves, and I get that. I totally get that. But as long as they can hear and understand and be supported quietly in a way that suits them, then that absolutely. So yeah, I think so as I say, my twins are 9. I feel like things have come along significantly since I went through it, but there's still quite a long way to go, isn't there?
And so I think from just mentioned the magic middle. We were at a different workshop a couple of weeks ago, which was also, we were talking about the penalty of motherhood. So from a personal experience perspective, I went through, so I did the kind of 10 years of IVF and didn't result, so I haven't got a biological child. That then resulted in, you can imagine the headlines around me. So then that resulted in a divorce. So I went through a fairly public divorce at work as well. Then went through a divorce, then met somebody else who's delightful, who's now my husband now. And now I've got a 12-year-old stepdaughter who I've known since she was 7. So I went through no children, IVF, not working, divorce, and then all of a sudden I did have caring responsibilities for a 7-year-old. I mean, what's that? I'm like, oh right, this is new. So then I kind of jumped straight, so then became a step parent, and because of my husband's in the police, so he's quite a lockdown, and it was all in lockdown with homeschooling and all that kind of stuff. I became the flexible parent. I was the one that was fairly flexible at home, and she's 50% with us, 50% with her mum, and we all get on great. So there was that sort of, in terms of process for me, but what I have been able to be, there has been the guilt, so the parent guilt's come into it a bit as well. But what I have been able to do is kind of speak really quite openly to my boss. So I've had 2 bosses throughout that period of time, with the same company. So I have stayed with the same company, but again, been really open. So again, talking to my boss, going from I can be wherever you want me to be at whatever time of the day you want me to be there, to now I've got to school drop off fairly instantly. He didn't see me have a baby, or he didn't see me do any of those things. So it's a bit of a different experience for him. He's like, oh yeah, you have got school drop off now. And he was like, yep, school drop. So, but I'm quite open. I've been able to talk about, and I'm reasonably, I sit on our SLT, so I am able to vocalize and say all these things. But the other thing that we talked about is that magic, I kind of talk about the magic middle. So that bunch of managers in the middle of an organization. So they're not really, so I can say, somebody in my team goes, need some time off. I was like, just take the day. I've got that confidence to go, don't you worry, because I know, don't worry, I'm a nice line manager. Crack on, don't worry about it. I've got the confidence to be able to do this. And you've got all the people underneath. You've got this magic middle in the back that kind of make everything happen. They are the ones that go, oh, I don't know if I'm supposed to, have I got the, whereas the policies therefore are that underlying, give people the confidence to go, automatically don't have to pick up the phone, they don't have to ask for advice. I know you can have 10 days off for your, actually the policy's telling me you can have 10 days off. So there you go, there's instant support that I can say, right, if you're going through something or somebody does open up and say, oh, I need, or any partner opens up and says, I need this, they're allowed 5 days off. So we just say that policy just gives that instant confidence to be able, there's an element of confidence to go, okay, I have no idea how to deal with this, but the policy says I can at least, so that's good news. I can at least give somebody some good news, then go and get some extra advice and support. So I think that magic, helping and supporting those middle managers that do unlock so much stuff that goes on in, you know, they're not the senior people that can kind of make it up as we go along, and they're not the really junior people that this is affecting. It really, the policies sort of help them. But then I agree, being able to talk a lot about things, and which is everything that's about working parent. Our paternity leave was dreadful for years. They now get 12 weeks full pay. So, you know, we were on 2 weeks statutory probably only till a couple of years ago, which is fairly horrendous for a working dad or a working partner. So things like that we've upped. So in terms of surrogacy policies are in there, foster care policies are in there, dependent care policies are in there, obviously shared parental leave came in, and they're all simply like, so just being able to find those policies, because that can be a minefield. And we talked a lot about big organizations, so especially when you're part of a big international subsidiary, it's like, which policy am I working? So we've kind of tried to, bring in lots of policies that help, but make it really easy to find them, so that actually that initial raise my confidence level to go, I have no idea to, oh look, there's a policy that I didn't know that existed. And the other thing that we've brought in is something called Peppy. I don't know if anybody's heard of Peppy, which has gone down really well. So Peppy's an app, and Peppy, it's kind of like various different stages of a life cycle. So it can be talking, there's a fertility section, there's a, when you've got a baby, when going through pregnancy section, menopause, and also men's health. And when that first got launched, I was out of the, I wasn't, so from a personal point of view, I was like, that's not relevant for me. Great, I can talk about it because I HR and I'm supposed to talk about it, but I've done the IVF thing, it's a bit late for that. Well, I haven't had a baby, I've not done that, and I'm not quite hitting menopause age yet, so why is it relevant to me? So I get, but what I have found is different things in there, and I have logged on and gone, actually, it is quite useful. There's lots of different things in there. So I think it's also about having lots of variety of different things, like well-being. It's such a hard topic. It's only relevant to you at a point in time, and well-being means so many different things. So I think on all of this, it's being really open and honest, but having that foundation and having lots of things available that can be, but it's not overwhelming, that there is just so much and you don't know where to signpost people to.
Guys, I think you're right. I think I do think managers need the most support during these situations. And my manager supported me through so many situations. If I could change one thing, it would be when I was sat at home, sitting there with my cat, feeling completely lonely, and actually considering jacking my job in, attending interviews in secret because I just wanted to leave my company. It was a weird instinctive thing. I can't go back there. It's humiliating. I've been through enough. I just can't go back there. If I'd had access to more tools or organizations to talk to, or people checking in on me, it could have been like, I've seen, you know, they have these buddy systems. You know, there could be a miscarriage buddy in the organization who reaches out to people. I'd have really welcomed that. And I think it would have really changed my experience for the best. They did everything they could, but more could be done. And that's 10 years on, you know, basically. I now have a son, but it took a long time to get to that point. And having had that constant time off work, you lack that engagement with your business. Very isolating.
Yeah, I think from my point, I was lucky enough that I left my job and I had the means to not work while I was going through IVF. But looking back, I can't imagine myself actually, at least with the company that I was with previously, I can't imagine going myself through IVF and working. Our situation was quite complicated, so I had lots of procedures, lots of drugs. At one point, I was like 6 injections a day. And the state it put me in was just horrendous. So that was one thing. So going through IVF and working, I don't think was possible, at least in the workplace that I was. But also then, when I fortunately enough got pregnant, I had similar thing to you, Karen, but I was lucky to keep the baby. I had this hematoma, which happened around 20 weeks. We found out around 20 weeks that it was happening. But from then on, I was nearly on bed rest. And then how do you deal with that if you work? Again, I was fortunate enough not to work, but if I was in a place of work, then how does a company deal with something like this? Because I wasn't allowed, well, I was just about allowed to leave the house from time to time. I wasn't allowed to do anything. Traveling to work, which for me was 2 hours each way, was not an option at all. So then what do you do when someone who is pregnant tells you at 20 weeks that they can't really work?
And
So
subchronic hematoma, Google it.
Oh, I know. It was horrendous, but we managed. We got one. We're lucky enough to have said. But it's for companies. How do you deal with a case like this, for example, where in theory I should be starting my maternity leave, but then that means I have to go back when the child is like 4 months old. So what do you do?
Yeah, so that was similar for me. So I developed significantly high blood pressure from 16 weeks and was back and forth to the hospital, and actually then delivered at 28 weeks because I had preeclampsia. And I think there were kind of multiple things at play there that the doctors think caused it. So combination of the IVF treatment, the twin pregnancy, and the fact that I suffer from polycystic ovaries are all kind of increasing factors for preeclampsia. But I was the same. So rushed into hospital at 16 weeks with ridiculous blood pressure, kind of kept on bed rest on and off from that point. Didn't want to go on maternity leave early because like you, Jo, I didn't want to go back to work really early. And actually, again, back to the very fortunate because supportive manager at 28 weeks was just really, really unwell. And so I spoke to him and he was like, look, you've been through too much to get to this point and mess it up. So please just go and get yourself signed off sick, stay off sick. You don't have to start your maternity leave early. I'm quite happy to support that. But actually then, so I went to get myself signed off sick and my GP was like, get yourself down to the hospital because this does not look good. And I actually delivered the next day. So I did start my maternity leave early, but then again, that's a whole different world. And I know that things are improving in that area, but you know, I having premature babies that spent 6 weeks in special care felt robbed, I guess, of that whole period that was taken from my maternity leave, which I know the rules are changing around that. But same for my husband, you know, like he had to get himself signed off sick to look after me in hospital for a little while. And you know, there's so many things there that make a horrendously stressful situation even worse. And yeah, I think coupled with the time off that I'd had for treatment, I was probably off work on and off for about 18 months, which as a career focused woman really impacted my confidence and my imposter syndrome, because you know, possibly people weren't thinking, oh my god, like she's hardly ever here, but I was worried that they were thinking about that. And you don't need that worry when you're going through that stuff as well, do you? So it's all of that stuff.
I think it's a kind of a society, we assume it's like that, and we see that translated into workplaces where we've seen policies where it has mentioned IVF, but it's been alongside cosmetic surgery, or even Invisalign. If you're having elective treatments such as Invisalign or IVF, then you need to take unpaid leave, or you need to use your annual leave, and there's no leave available or flexibility. And that is really difficult for someone who has found themselves in a situation where their only way of having a child is through fertility treatment. So that's one of the things that we hear. But just going back to your question, Shireen, around what organisations can do, and I know Vicky spoke to a lot of this, what we do at Fertility Matters at Work is we have an accreditation which allows organisations to become fertility friendly, and it is trying to make sure that there's this cultural shift, that it's not just a tick box exercise of, yes, we've got a policy in place, let's move on, because let's face it, if the culture's not right for people to be able to share, they won't feel comfortable in using the policy. So we think about the employee support pathway. So from that very moment you find out, the first thing you normally do is look for something in writing. What am I entitled to? Through to emotional support. So through the EAP scheme, if you've got one, is there a peer-to-peer support network? But also that manager support pathway as well, because managers have got so much on their plate. They can't know everything about everything, and they've not experienced this. You can't expect that they'll have knowledge to hand. But is there some training available that they can access? So we have an e-learning program that managers can access, or we do lunch and learn sessions where we bring to life this experience with internal employees who talk about it, and we share just that seem really simple to us. So little tips like, don't try and give unwanted advice, that the impact that it can have on someone if you say to them, oh, just adopt. Well, there's no just about adoption. It's a whole new path to parenthood. It's not simple. Comments such as just relax, and at least it was early, at least you lost them. And all of these little things that people try and say to try and fix the situation or put a positive spin on it, when actually they make it worse. And it's so simple at the end of the day. All you need to do is say to someone, oh, it must be really, really hard. Can I do anything? I'm here for you. But we do need to have that level of education. So as part of the accreditation, we look at that policy piece or guidance. Some organisations would prefer to have a guidance document. Flexible working, this is really key for going through IVF. I mean, it's not that people necessarily want to have days and days off work. Often work is a welcome distraction, but the flexibility to attend that appointment and then still do your work, whether it's working from home or to come in a little bit later after that appointment, that can help keep that person in work and save them going off sick and trying to hide the fact that they're going through treatment. But also things like lunch and learns. Have you got an intranet page where you share stories and information? So we've curated so many different conversations and interviews around all of these different aspects. So people who have been down the LGBTQ route and alternative paths, being childless not by choice. Actually, Lucy, there's an organisation I'd want to point you to if you weren't aware of them, called Gateway Women, and we work with them, and they provide expert advice. And so it's about giving organisations the tools to be able to provide this to their employees and show that they not only recognise that this is something that they're going through, but they'll support it as well. So there's loads of things that organisations can do, but it's not just about that tick box, let's put a policy in, we're done and we move on. It's about that cultural shift, because we are so far away still in people hiding injections in toilets. We've heard people putting them in sandwich boxes to bring them in and hiding them at the back of the fridge. Or simply taking long-term sick because it's the only way they feel they can do IVF and work and to do that. So there is so much that can be done, but I think these sort of conversations are the real starter. And we see how the menopause conversation has shifted over the past few years, and like where we were like 10 years ago, if someone would have said we'd be talking about menopause in the workplace, you'd have laughed. You said it wouldn't be relevant, but now it's a really integral part of many organizations. And so I feel like fertility's just a few years behind, but on that same trajectory really. And I think you guys, in terms of sharing your story, are all part of that, and in terms of really bringing to life what it means to go through this, like physically, emotionally. And I think also that hasn't been mentioned today is financial as well, which again links in really greatly to your job security and everything else as well. So yeah.
Thank you for breaking it down and making it really tangible as well. And that's certainly for people listening. We want everyone to be able to share their stories as well, because it isn't a one size fits all, and that is part of it. And it almost makes it easy for people to hide behind, because it isn't easy to talk about, and therefore why should we deal with it? But the more we start to unpick, the more we can find nuances. And I absolutely love your point around what is that cultural shift, what is that communication shift, because it's great to have policies, but unless you've got people advocating and pushing them, then what does that mean? And that brings me to my next question. I'd like Joe Propton and Lucy to speak to this, and everyone else as well. And hopefully what you were going to say will take you in this direction, is how can we help women to advocate for themselves as well? Because not everyone is going to be vocal. Not everyone will know what policies are available to them. Not everyone wants to, come onto a podcast and be brave enough to share these stories. But what about those people? And hopefully in that you'll also cover what you wished you had at that time as well. So Joe Propton, I'll come to you, then Lucy, and then obviously everybody else, please come in as well.
I think for me, with fertility, it's not something that happens. It's not like a month issue, if that makes sense. It's years, and it takes a very big toll on your mental well-being. And I think sometimes, at least with myself, at the beginning, I was not so much with workplace, but outside of workplace, I was quite open about my struggles, but I very quickly stopped discussing it, because you get a lot of pity, and you get a lot of these very well-meant thoughts about, for example, or just take it easy, don't stress about it. Mine was because at that point, I had been vegetarian for many years, and quite a few of the older generation people told me, oh, if only you start eating meat, you will get pregnant. And I was like, okay. And then about the supplements. And I think with work, I remember even at the beginning when finally I had to tell them about my miscarriage and things. Initially, I got some, maybe not support, but sympathy. But very quickly it dried off. It was like, okay, well, this is going on for too long. You just need to crack on. It's almost like the expectation was, well, you've been through it many times, so you should be used to it by now, if that makes sense. And for some of us, it can take years. It's not something that, unfortunately, is resolved within months or even a year or two. For myself, I was still fortunate that it only took us 5 years, but 5 very long years of mental strain. And if you think about working and going through it, not only you feel bad about yourself, you feel self-conscious. I felt like a failure, because I felt like, well, I'm a woman, it's expected. Everyone is saying, oh, it's normal, it's natural to have kids, but it's not for me. So I felt very badly about myself. I felt like a really, really self-conscious and like a failure, like I'm letting myself down, like I'm letting my partner down. And I think, again, that is, Seb is not 5, so we're talking years and years ago. It is getting better from what I can see, but it's the lack of mental support at work when it comes to fertility, miscarriages, IVF, I would say.
Thank you, Joe. And Lucy?
Yeah, just going back to, I think something that Becky said about flexible working. I think that can be quite awkward sometimes for people like me. Like, I don't have to do a school run. There's no real reason why I would potentially need flexi working. So I find that's been quite difficult in the past to request it, because I don't have a child that needs picking up from school and things. So it makes it feel quite awkward, because you might get asked why. And actually, I've got as much right as anybody to take flexi working, but I just don't feel comfortable, or I haven't felt comfortable. And even like we've just I brought out a new policy at work for family leave, which is brilliant. And, it's advertised across all the internet and stuff. And I'm like, oh, well, I'll, put that to one side with all the other ones that are coming out, which is great. They are coming out and things are changing. And obviously you guys especially will be like, yep, this is fantastic. But in terms of me, it's a bit more like, I do feel like that emotional dissonance. So at work, I'm like, yeah, this is great. I get in the car and I drive home and I'm like, yeah, I'm not feeling so great about this. But then what do I do about that? I can't then say, well, can I have, time off for what low mood because of my fertility? Like, what box would I tick to be able to be understood in the workplace for how I feel? If that makes sense. So it's a bit strange in terms of that. And because my fertility is due to be, I was diagnosed, well, I'm not even diagnosed, but I went through an eating disorder when I was in my late teens. And so that's 20 odd years ago. And so that was what stemmed, not being able to have kids. And so I don't want to talk about that really ever. And so that's a difficult thing for me, because when people ask me, I'm quite an open and honest person, but I'm not going to give that kind of information, especially in the workplace. So it's like kind of drawing the line. I'm like, yeah, my barrier's up a little bit, but it's come down to, like, I've never had these conversations with people before. So it's quite a brave thing to do, but it's worth it. Definitely worth it.
Brave, and thank you so much for just having that conversation and acknowledging the power that you have by giving your story, because there will be other people listening. There'll be, your experiences will resonate with everyone in this room, absolutely, as well. And what would you like from a cultural perspective within the workplace? And maybe other people can support this as well, because we all work within organizations and support organizations. How do we support people who are child free for many different reasons without having to say, tell me why? And that whole flexi working, you're absolutely right. Everyone has the right to ask for it. How do we encourage our managers to be okay with those conversations without there being an immediate, obvious need for it? How do we support that human being?
I think sorry, Becky, I was just going to say, I just think people should just think before they speak. Like, you don't know what's behind. It's quite simple. You don't have to know everything about everything. Just simply think that person's a human, and you just don't know their story.
Yeah, we do a lot of work around kind of breaking down these assumptions that are made. Well, yeah, just because she hasn't got a child, then she can work Christmas, or she won't be asking for time off during the school holidays. It's all of these things that people just assume. And we work with a lady who delivers training on childlessness in the workplace, and getting people to think about things differently, and actually, how does that make that group of people feel? Because actually it's a bigger group than people realize. I'm trying to remember the stat. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it is a big group of people who are often left, particularly in the workplace where there is so much talk around family leave and everything else, that feeling, well, where do I fit in? Like, what's there to support me? And I know what you said about you don't feel able to request flexible working or part-time work. And when I was going through my IVF, I actually reduced my hours to 4 days, but I really didn't feel comfortable asking for it. I was thinking to myself, well, I thought I'd be asking for this at the point when I had a child, but I was actually asking for it to try and have a child, and to enable me to try and cope with both things. And it's again, it's this narrative that only people with children can work flexibly. Well, that shouldn't be the case. So, I mean, I think to talk about shifting mindsets and opening up these conversations, and I think a lot of it's about choice. Not everybody needs to shout it from the rooftops and go on a podcast and share these things, but what we need to enable people to have is to feel like they've got the choice, and that it's safe to share if they want to. Whereas we're in a position at the moment where people feel they've got no choice but to keep it to themselves, if they don't feel safe. And there's a quote that I absolutely love. It's from Anne Voskamp, and it's shame dies when stories are told in safe spaces. And I think that's the responsibility of organisations, to be able to tell these stories in create those safe spaces. And if there's people internally who don't yet feel comfortable, then bring in organisations like ourselves, where we can bring speakers with different backgrounds. So we bring people in who have talked about male fertility. So we have men who come and talk about these things, which is very rare. We talk about childlessness, we talk about all of these other things, and that then it's almost that sense of validation that you can give to other people, that it's not just me. My organisation understands this because they're sharing this story, and then I feel comfortable to come forward. And whether that be on a one-to-one basis or within an internal peer support network, it's different ways that you can do it, but it just starts fostering that culture of psychological safety. It's been psychologically safe enough to talk about these really, really personal, sensitive things that have all got their own backstory, but not everyone needs to know the full backstory, but they just need to be mindful of the impact that things that happen in the workplace have on that particular group. And it's not saying you can't say anything to everyone, it's just about being aware, it's about being kind, it's about being empathetic. So yeah, I think there's so much we can do. I'm really passionate about trying to get this point across, because it's not just a quick thing, it's something that we need to change over time.
Absolutely, it's a cultural shift and mindset shift. Karen, I can see you wanted to come in.
Yeah, it is a cultural shift and a mindset shift. I would echo that. And on reflection, it's about feeling valued by your organisation. So having come from a traditional sales environment my whole life, it was a low feeling of self-worth that I carried throughout my whole fertility journey. And if my organization had had said, okay, Karen, gosh, you need us now. Why don't we do something for you? You've generated all this revenue for us. Now for you, as you struggle with your miscarriages and you're on your knees, I can see the emotional pain you're in. Hey, here's some private care for you. Go and see where you can get to with this. If that had happened to me, and I would do this in my own organization that I run, I would have felt tremendously valued and that I mattered to my organization. And then if you feel you matter to the organization, you're more open, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And it all links back. If businesses say, well, what's the return on investment if I'm going to do something like this? It's about retention, it's about employee engagement, it's about attraction as well. And we know 36% of people will consider leaving. And I think you said yourself, Karen, your instant reaction was, I'm going to leave this organisation, go elsewhere. Whereas, as you've just said, if you'd have had that care and that you've given to us for so long, we're going to help you through this difficult life event, then you paid your organisation back in terms of, all that.
I attempted an interview after one of my miscarriages, and I soon learned otherwise, because in the interview I was asked if I wanted to start a family. I was so thrown by it that I literally just, obviously a proper woman would have gone no. I said yes, and then I was told I wasn't appropriate for the job. And I thought, really?
It's such judgment that we carry. And Becky, I really loved your point about being kind, and Karen, you spoke about this earlier around seeing your employees as assets and not burdens. And life takes us in so many different directions, and this is the thing with the whole of the intersectionality piece, is unpicking all of those stories. And human beings come in all different shapes, sizes, colors, creeds, all the rest of it. How can we support people in every stage of their life? And absolutely to Becky's point, so they can be the best employees, they can feel they belong, and they can give back to the organization, to the sector, etc., in a way that keeps them there. And there is that retention. It's way more expensive to recruit people than it is to keep your people. Why is that not something that is obvious? Any final words? This isn't the end of this conversation, of course. We one podcast doesn't change that culture, and so this is very much an ongoing thing. But I feel this has been a really amazing start to this conversation, just to lay out as much as we can onto the table. Say, hey, this is what's happening to people.
I think my last kind of thought is that people need to we need to raise the awareness of the fertility struggles, so that people can be a bit kinder, more aware of what is the right thing to ask, what is the right thing to say, what isn't. And also not to assume, because I think there still is an assumption that a woman should have a child, that is what we do, that it's a natural thing, or and then if you don't have one, then there's something wrong with you. But there isn't, and it may be out of issues, but it also may be a choice of life. So I think that people need to think that women are not just made to have kids, that they may choose not to, but also not to ask them why they don't have them, because it may not be out of choice. So just be a bit more aware and a bit kinder in that respect.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And it's also, it's not just women, it's the men as well, who often don't suppose not to speak much about things that affect them, but they're affected by all this as well. They have their own fertility issues. So I think it needs to be a really wide conversation, and really open and honest, and give people a safe space.
I think I would just finally add that if you kind of thinking, where do I even start with this? I haven't got a clue, because a lot of people struggle when it's such a sensitive topic. They don't want to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. There are organisations like Fertility Matters at Work who can support you with that, whether it be let's start a lunch and learn, let's just introduce this topic to the organisation, ask your people what they're feeling and what they would like to hear. Or it might be that let's start with a policy and then let's move from there. There's starting points. You don't have to do everything all at once. It's a process. But you don't have to do it on your own. And actually, there will probably be people within your organisation who can help support and drive this, because quite often the best work that we've seen through the organisations that we work with have been where it's been employee-led and driven by those with their own personal experience, because that's the passion behind it, and that's where you see the real change.
Thank you. Final words to Karen.
it's complicated, isn't it? And I think listening to all these conversations just brings it home how complicated it is. And it's been so nice to share my experience, but also to hear from other people's experiences and not to feel alone, because it's not something I talk about very often. So it's been really lovely to hear from other people on their ongoing journeys, because it is an ongoing journey for many, because you've got to grieve as well, haven't you?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We've obviously just scraped the very, very tippy top of this conversation, and there will be other podcasts and roundtables and events, etc., that Women in Transport, where we go deep dive. And you mentioned grief, Karen, as well, and that's one of the topics I really want to pick up in a subsequent podcast, because grief comes in many different shapes and sizes, and just to have that that conversation unpacked as well. And just thank you so much to all of our guests today. I have so much love for people just come and bringing their true selves into what are very emotive conversations, and they leave you feeling something. I know you're going to be thinking about the rest of the day, and it isn't something you just kind of switch off. So genuinely appreciative of the time, the effort, the energy that it takes to bring your true selves to this, and hopefully we support other people by having these conversations.
You've been listening to the Women in Transport podcast. Join us next time as we hear more from the women in our sector. Please visit the website for more details on how to become a member of Women in Transport, and remember to like, follow and share this podcast.